Our story begins with the first entry in the diary of one man who got caught up in a game of gods who called themselves players and used humans as game characters. The first entry in his diary began with the fact that one day in the year 2023, they were summoned to a separate world that was completely different from the normal world we were all used to. Although to be more accurate, only parts of large cities from different parts of the earth, from New York to Cairo, went to this new world. Each summoned part was given a different number, and the diary owner's part of the city was number 76. In 103 entries, the owner of the diary explained that they had come to a place where there was a game of beings of the higher world. They were called different names, gods, titans, higher beings of existence. And their piece of the city was just a small figure on the playing board, where everything was decided by the will of the gods' players and by chance. And each player had his own piece city, which he controlled, and the fate of all the people inside depended on his decisions. In entry number 224 he continued to explain the rules of this game, in which the god players rolled dice and moved their pieces. Each square on the playing board corresponded to a different mission, in which the game pawns, humans, had to clear and complete incredibly difficult and painful missions, which could be represented by a battle assignment, a maze, or an investigation. Somewhere at the end of the chain of these mission cages, there was a finish line visible that no one had yet reached. And the role of humans as creatures belonging to the playing figure was one: to protect their figure until the end of the game, in the existence of which they were not even sure. The unknown warrior whose diary we read with a doomed face was finishing his last 743rd entry. He was surrounded by the ruins of a building, flames and many corpses that had laid down their weapons. His last entry stated that he and his 76 figure had lost to another stronger and luckier figure, and now the fate of the surviving men on that figure was not enviable. For the figures that lost were destroyed and all who were there died. And no matter how sad it was, their figure would suffer the same fate despite their best efforts. That's why he purposely left these notes written in blood and sweat, not even knowing if anyone else would see them but him or not. But he still had hoped that whoever found them wouldn't share his fate. The last thing he had warned about, in his notes, was that no matter what, one should not even try to rebel against the players who ran the game. No matter how powerful their weapons or skills were by human standards. It wasn't even worth the thought of trying to rebel against the players. After all, at the end of the day, the humans in the game only had a tiny fraction of their power in this game. It was their game with their rules, and there was nothing the humans could do about it. And as soon as a figure lost on one of the squares, one of the gods immediately destroyed it with his spear. After such a blow, the figure was shattered into pieces and scattered in the space that surrounded the playing field. And after some time, this skeleton is among the ruins floating in space with a pile of records in front of it. Someone had finally found it. He took the last record from the skeleton's hands and quickly looked through it, assessing the quality of his strategies. They were really not bad. But still, he didn't need them, so he just tossed them onto the sawed floor of the ruins. He already knew how things worked here, so he was going to leave the skeleton of this lone warrior here for the rest of time. One of the players noticed him take off from the island of surviving structures and turned his attention to them. And after tossing a few dice in his palm, he was about to attack this insolent man who dared to escape from the game board. With a blow of tremendous force he decided to destroy the surviving island with a few buildings on it, so that these pathetic bugs could not hide here anymore. However, his spear met incredible resistance on its way and even stopped completely. It was our future hero who had the power to do this. He agreed with that dead man's notes in everything, except for one final warning. And with the speed of red lightning, he swept across the player's spear heading for his hand. In a moment he was already near what must have been the player's face and preparing to strike back. The blow was so powerful that it reflected a red flash on the player's face. After the blow, almost half of his face was missing and his huge carcass was falling in space. It was still possible to challenge the players, but even this blow wasn't enough to destroy the player who was already starting to regenerate. However, after a moment the regeneration stopped, and the missing part of his face lit up with a blue light. The player made a horrible sound that resembled a scream. As it turned out, our hero had a quality guidebook to help him fill in his missing knowledge, and he already knew how to destroy the player for sure. He was certain that he was not going to obediently suffer here for the rest of his days just because of some stupid game of the gods. So he was going to kill the players and the game and return to his home world, so that there would be no more poor people like that skeleton in the future. Which by the way managed to survive, and after the second blow on the island, which shattered into even smaller pieces, his skeleton began to crumble. And only his shining white gold armor remained there. Nothing could stop our hero, who was sure that he could, together with his friends and allies, put an end to this cursed game. But how did our hero's story begin? It was an ordinary peaceful day like any other. And on such a wonderful sunny day absolutely nothing foreshadowed trouble. Our hero was quietly going about his business on a busy street of his city. He was listening to music and was in a great mood, which, it would seem, nothing could spoil. As it turned out, he was only one step away from safety, which he didn't have time to do. And what happened was something that absolutely no one expected. Right in front of the sneakers of our hero ran a blue flash, which made him stop. He stared at it incomprehensibly, not knowing what it was and where it came from. After the flash right in front of him appeared a barrier separating this part of the city from everything around. Not only our hero was scared, the rest of the citizens also in a panic began to scatter, wondering what it could be, an earthquake or a terrorist attack. It turned out that this day was the last peaceful for those who were inside the barrier, which had already begun to separate from the ground. Our hero continued to stand at the very edge of the barrier and saw everything perfectly, as their barrier with a flash of light teleported to some unknown place in the middle of space. He was shocked by such events and could barely keep himself from panicking like the rest of his city. However, he was even more surprised when he looked down. He didn't understand what was happening and why a piece of his city was suddenly on top of a stone pedestal with the number 8 on it. While the terrified citizens came to their senses and wondered what it was, and were horrified by the lack of cellular communication, our hero could not believe how all that he read in novels and manga could happen in reality, spatial teleportation to another world and other nonsense. Information windows began to appear in front of the citizens like in some computer game. The poor people didn't know what surprised and scared them more. The information windows notified that the game had started and asked everyone to throw a dice. Even our hero was also a little confused. He wondered what the hell was going on, what game, what dice. It was all starting to annoy him. Before they knew it, something huge began to fall on them from above. It seemed to them that they were about to be crushed. But as it turned out, it was also a dice, but of gigantic size, and it was flying right at them. The hero couldn't believe his eyes. Was it really a dice too? Which was getting closer and closer to the barrier. After a moment, the dice fell on the barrier with the number 3 on the top edge. Immediately there was a notification from the system, which notified everyone that their figure was moving 3 fields forward. The figure shook before starting to move. If you counted from it, it should have hit the box with the shield icon. Their figure began to move quickly towards the target. The citizens were scared again, but that wasn't all, and the worst was ahead of them. Meanwhile, our hero was beginning to add up the facts 1 plus 1 and assumed that apparently they had been called into the game. Only in this game they weren't players at all. They were part of game figure 8. Which means the real players in this game were those creatures rolling the dice. Finally, their figure stopped. The hero continued to ponder, since their city was just a figure chosen by the player. It was a logical question. If the players only wanted a figure, they could probably summon a part of the city without people. Why would they need citizens? He was distracted from his musings by the next information window that appeared in front of him. It said that they had arrived at the defense field. To choose the difficulty and time of the defense, roll the dice. Just then they heard another dice roll against the barrier, with the number 1, which meant the first level of difficulty for them. It was followed by the next roll of the dice, where the number 3 was rolled, which meant for them 3 days during which they had to defend themselves. The map notification appeared, and from somewhere below the figure a section of forest and mountains began to rise to the top. And as soon as it aligned with the town, their platforms connected. The citizens didn't understand where the land had come from or what was happening, but they had no time left as the army was closing in on them. In front of them appeared windows that warned them that the defense mission was about to begin and they would need to defend themselves for 3 days. And they were given 4 key points that they needed to defend at all costs. Otherwise, after capturing the key points, their figure would lose and die. The citizens had a logical question, but what about them? If the figure dies, what will happen to them? They began to complain and demand to bring them back in the hope to influence something, but how wrong they were, not realizing in what position they are in and what their complaints and requests are worth. But this was well understood by our hero, who knew that there was no point in it and, if they had needed to, they would have contacted them initially and resolved all the issues freely. At that moment, the only thing they could do was to focus on these notices, which at that moment, told them that the citizens would be provided with the necessary equipment. And each of the citizens had been given a dice that they were invited to roll. Our hero held a dice with 100 ribs in his hand. It was something new to him. A window appeared in front of him, stating that there was a 60% chance of a normal class item falling out, a 20% chance of a magic, a 14% chance of a heroic, a 5% chance of a legendary, and only a 1% chance of a mystic class item. While everyone was looking at the dice and information windows, one man shouted that something was coming. And it definitely wasn't rescuers with the rumbling and stomping of many figures approaching them. It was an army of horrible monsters of many different kinds, armed and thirsty for blood. The citizens panicked and started running away from the barrier and calling out for someone to help. The army of monsters with a menacing roar burst into the city trying to catch up with the unfortunate citizens. And they did it very well. Used to a peaceful life, citizens were not ready for such a sprint and one by one became victims of monsters. Our hero was not an exception. One orc with a club quickly caught up with him and swung his club. His blow was so strong that our hero went flying as if he was a rag doll. And already in flight he finally understood why the men on the figure were needed, for its protection. But this understanding did not seem to help him. He flew straight into a pile of boxes in the middle of the road, which cushioned his hard landing at least a bit. Thus began a board game for their city, in which they were only required to defend the city as they progressed towards their goal and complete their missions. It was a board game of higher beings, who entertained themselves out of boredom, if they had any. After the first attempt, the orc held a bloody cudgel in his hands and was about to finish what he started looking at the still alive guy. Suddenly some shadow flew over them with a whoosh. And in a moment a flying girl with wings and a spear in her hands appeared behind their backs. She stabbed her spear into the ground and activated her skill. A fire tornado appeared in her place and began to rush towards the monsters. All the monsters that were on that street were scattered and burned by the tornado's flames. The surviving citizens looked in amazement at their savior. They were thrilled that all the monsters had died in the blink of an eye and wondered who she was. Her name was Go Haiju and she was just an ordinary citizen like them, but she was lucky as she had gotten a legendary class item, Empirical Flame Dragon Prominence's Canine, which allowed the owner to borrow the Empirical Dragon's power. She shouted for all the injured citizens to run to Namsan Tower, and for the military and police to form a defense line, and added for everyone to hurry up and roll their dice. The puzzled citizens stared at the dice in their hands, unsure of what to do with them. But since their savior told them to roll, they rolled them. She also explained to them that whatever number they rolled would give them a weapon of a certain quality. And in case they got a common class, she advised them to retreat. If they got a magical class or higher, she asked them to help her. Surprised citizens did not understand how they had weapons in their hands, but everything happened as they were told, so the words of this girl, who also saved them, could be trusted. Therefore, when a new wave of monsters rushed at them, they already with weapons in their hands ran at them in attack, trying to help her. That day, they said goodbye to their normal lives and started a completely different one. On the very first day of this new life, countless people died. But at the same time, several legendary heroes were also born, whose power could not be matched by any first-level monster so far. Meanwhile, when the whole place was engulfed in flames, our hero, whose name was Choi Yul, was still lying unconscious clutching his dice in his hand. But eventually his hand began to weaken and his fingers started to unclench. And the dice did fall out of his hand. His dice rolled around on the ground. And so here on the 8th piece he became the strongest, for he was incredibly lucky to hit that 1% probability on the dice and roll 100. However, such luck would soon lead to everyone else calling him the worst scum in the future. After all, he was given a special book called Demon King of Sovereignty Krasina's book, which allowed him to use the library of Demon King Krasina who desires anything and everything and gives the user access to any information such as item locations, hidden events, monster information, map and objectives once the mission starts. The book glowed with red lightning and soared into the air in front of the unconscious hero. However, the Demon King Krasina, the very fulfillment of the desire for obedience and from this one thing came out of it, which in the future will be a surprise to the others and the reason for his hatred. It consisted of the following: all rewards received by other users thanks to the information in this book would belong to the owner of Krasen's book, namely our hero Choi Yo. In the 3 hours after the defense mission started, 3,102 people died and 7,023 were injured. In addition, out of the 4 bases that people had to defend, 1 was destroyed. On the road that was scorched, there was a girl with a spear in her hands and flaming wings behind her. Besides, a pillar of fire was rising directly from her. It was none other than Go Haiju, who was in minor burns and scratches, who was now wondering if everything was over. A few other people who also looked shabby after the battle began to rejoice from the fact that they were able to survive and win. Suddenly, a military truck stopped behind them, causing them to turn around in surprise. A soldier got out of the truck and announced that the Korean army had arrived. After him, more soldiers started to get out of the trucks and began evacuating the wounded as well as ordinary citizens, telling them that they would take them to Namsan Tower, where it was the safest place to be. At the same time, a soldier came up to Go Haiju and saluted her, telling her that she had done a good job. She waved her hand and said that it was no big deal. He continued, saying that she had bought them a lot of time, during which the army and police were able to organize themselves and spread out. That soldier was Sergeant Kwon Jae-yong, who had a heroic rank held in Cult Inquisitor helmet. Due to the special material, the helmet user did not fall into a state of confusion, fear, or bewilderment. Go Haiju turned to the sergeant and asked if it was all over. To which he replied that the calls and internet were not working, making it difficult to assess the situation. However, adding that they were using radio communication, so they would be able to get reports from each location soon. Heading towards the car, he said that they needed to visit Namsan Tower, to which the latter agreed, following him. However, a voice suddenly sounded behind them, causing them to turn around in surprise. That voice appeared to belong to Choi Yo, who was holding a book in his hand and also saying something about this wasn't the end. He was staggering towards them. As it turned out, he had a very ragged appearance. One eye was closed, there was a cut on his forehead that was bleeding, and his clothes were covered in blood. As he came closer, he announced that the boss was going to show up soon. Then he opened the book he was holding and added that it said so. Also stating that there was also mission information, monster data, current progress and everything else. Determined to prove his words, he unfolded the book and showed it to the soldier and the girl, who stared at it in disbelief. However, after a second pause, they replied that they couldn't see anything as the pages were blank. Hearing this, Choi Yo cried out in surprise. He wondered if he was the only one who could see the contents. The sergeant replied that it was probably true. Thinking about the guy's words, Kwon Jae-yong concluded that if the guy's words were true, then the item he possessed was very powerful, since in this case, information was equal to power. Jae-yong decided to check if the guy's words were true, so he asked him to tell him more, which he agreed to do. Opening the book and turning the page, he began to read, starting by saying that the held-in helmet was a helmet of heroic rank, and one of a set of 6 items, also saying that the user's name was Kwon Jae-yong, and that he had 21 days left before he was dismissed. Then turning to the girl he said that her name was Go Haiju, also saying that she possessed the legendary class weapon Empyrean Flame Dragon Fawn. Then surprisingly added that her favorite karaoke song was Chilgap Mountain. Upon hearing this, the girl blushed and pointed her spear at the guy and ordered him to stop, while the sergeant noted that she had good taste. Go Haiju and Kwon Jae-yong unanimously agreed that he was telling the truth, and that the book did contain truthful data. After realizing this, Kwon Jae-yong said to himself that if the words were true, then they were really going to meet the boss. He then took out a walkie-talkie and said that since they had confirmed the item's abilities, he should contact the headquarters and inquire about further action. Watching the piece on the board from somewhere above, someone's voice reflected on the fact that he had been thinking about it all along. If this world was a game, he would most likely be a character with a bug. Since this world's problems were too easy for him. And that was most likely why they made it that way, for the purpose of keeping him out of the world. Pondering was a guy in hospital pajamas and a bandage on his head, who was sitting in front of a large hole in the wall from which a bright light was shining. Behind him, however, were a number of board games scattered about. As he continued to stare at the bright light, he said thoughtfully that if someone from above had found the bug and isolated it, then if there ever came a day when he could return to the world, then. Choi Yo, the sergeant's loud voice called out to the guy, who came to his senses and immediately turned around at the voice. Kwon Jae-yong looked at the guy and said that he had received permission from the headquarters. Then, clutching the walkie-talkie in his hand, he said that it was literally a game of luck for them. However, since they had no other plan, they decided to believe his information. Afterwards, handing the guy the walkie-talkie, he asked him to provide all the information about what was going on. He replied that he would do his best. Choi Yo checked to see if he could be heard on the other end. He announced in a loud voice that he would now give information about the current defense mission. It was to protect the bases from the waves of monsters that came every 6 hours. And at the end of each one, a boss would appear. The first of which was a two-headed ogre of the first difficulty, which could use magic and melee combat. Victory was to be gained if they could defend the base 4 times a day, and if they defeated all the bosses. He then added that he had all the information about the mission, and if they used it to strategize, they would definitely be able to survive. Choi Yo also said that he would look for a way to bring them back to the normal world. Go Haiju, meanwhile, was watching the guy in front of her with astonishment and interest. Admiring and wondering that he was not only thinking about the mission, but also about the consequences. Standing still holding the book in his hands and taking a deep breath, he announced in a firm voice into the radio that he was starting the story. However, even before beginning to tell all the information, it was worth initially checking what he couldn't see while he was unconscious. Namely, that the Krasina books, from which all the information was taken, monopolized the awards of those with whom it was shared, as well as the accounts of those people. In addition, this number included not only those people who heard the information directly from the owner of the book, but also those who heard it from others, through rumors, or any other means. And any information that originated from the owner of the book, whether it was information about fighting monsters, squad building, information about bosses, or how to fight them, information about weapons and their abilities, how they were to be handled, about training, boss battles, their weaknesses, the level and characterization upgrades, which even led to visual changes, could end up playing havoc with those who recognized her. After all, it all belonged to the demonic sovereignty King Krasina. Playing piece number 8, population, 193,256. Sovereignty victims recorded, 176542. And in just one day, 91% of the population became sovereignty victims. However, this was only the beginning of our hero's sins, which continued until the last moment of the game. The game figure on which the action unfolded. This defensive mission was like a game in the tower defense genre. A crowd of orcs was walking along the road between the buildings of the city to their goal. In games of this genre, monsters march towards a base they must destroy while players must try to stop them. The 3 large armed orcs in front of them sensed something and were puzzled and froze in place. At the same moment, Choi Yo holding a walkie-talkie in one hand and a book in the other shouted that now was the time. At the same moment, the players who were sitting in ambush on the buildings according to the plan started firing at the monsters with long-range weapons. After firing, when some would leave to reload their weapons, others were to replace them and continue firing with another weapon. Taking advantage of the fact that the monsters of the first level of difficulty were quite stupid. By creating a barrier and firing at them, they could force them to go in the right direction. Then wound them as much as possible and split them up. Then it was the turn of the men who specialized in close combat, who would work together and use high-level equipment to finish off the monsters. At the same time, with a walkie-talkie in hand and leaning over the book, Choi Yo was giving out instructions and orders on how best to proceed. In Christina's book, the data was updated on what was happening in real time. The owner only needed to think of the information he needed and turn the page, and it would immediately appear in front of him. As Choi Yo continued to kneel in front of the book, not even changing his shirt, which was still stained with blood, he continued to give information about what was about to happen and how to act. The book gave him hope that he would succeed with it. And together with the others, he could survive this game. A pillar of smoke was rising above the city and sparks of flame could be seen. At the same time, the orcs were not in the best position, unable to resist in any way, they could only receive the blows that were coming at them from all sides. Kwon Jae-yong continued to fire at the monsters with his automatic rifle and informed his squad that the enemy had been eliminated, then ordered the third squad to inspect the area. Hearing this, the soldier who was acting as a communicator immediately replied that he would report back to Choi Yo. After the monsters were exterminated, Sergeant Kwon Jae-yong thought about the fact that at first, the headquarters command had decided what to do, given the guy's suggestions. However, now he was taking charge of the command. Kwon Jae-yong looked at the guy who was excitedly talking about something while holding a book in his hand, and remembered what he had said that the book was only information. Which meant that his skills to explain and command virtually an entire city were not due to the book, but his own. Or was it another ability of the book after all? However, the sergeant was interrupted from his thoughts by the voice of Choi Yo, who approached him and called his name. Then, with a tired smile on his face, he said that it was almost over. He turned to the guy and asked if that meant that the boss of the last wave was on his way. He replied that it did, but added that there was no need to worry about it. Go Haiju was going to finish him off in one hit. The girl who was the hope of all mankind was sleeping peacefully in the back of the truck in a sleeping bag. But a sudden rumbling sound made her open her sleepy eyes and look at her in bewilderment. As it turned out, in front of her was a huge earth golem, which was not particularly friendly, smiling at the girl. She saw him and immediately screamed in fright. The boss's name was Giant Billy. He was the first difficulty. His story said that he was a giant who was born weak and was abandoned. Also, the information from the system window said that despite his enormous size he was weak in battle. Seeing that the girl was awake, Choi Yo, who was still holding the book, smiled and greeted the girl, who came to her senses and asked indignantly why they hadn't woken her up. To which the sergeant, pulling the pin from the grenade, replied that there were no flashes. Then he immediately threw a grenade at the giant, which exploded and blinded him. With a furious roar, he slammed his huge fist into the ground where the truck had been a second before. Still in the sleeping bag, the shocked Go Haiju asked the guy what was going on. He replied that if they let that monster into the city, all the bases would be destroyed immediately. And that's why they came here. The next moment, the military truck stopped in the middle of the field. Looking at the giant that was standing on all fours and also looking at them, Choi Yo said that it was very good that it was very slow and had no resistance to the elements, adding that they could easily defeat it if they covered it with a hail of attacks. As the girl climbed down from the back of the truck, she asked in surprise how they could do so much damage if they were the only ones here. The guy turned to the girl and said that he wasn't talking about them. He was talking about her. Choi Yo's words took her by surprise, as she didn't understand how she could pull this off. At the same time, the giant regained his senses and began to approach our heroes again. Grabbing her spear and using a skill that made it glow with a bright flame, Go Haiju asked Choi Yo what she should do. Choi Yo looked at the book and said that items above heroic rank have hidden abilities. And if they are performed, they can change the shape of the item or activate a hidden ability. However, in order to find out what those abilities were, the requirements had to be met first. Adding that the book had all the information about the items. In the middle of the field, being blessed by the pink sunset, holding a spear in her hand stood a lone girl. It was none other than Go Haiju, who turned to Choi Yo and asked him if he was sure of what he was saying. He told her not to believe him, but to believe the book, which had never been wrong before. The giant kneeling on his knees reached out his huge hand to the girl in front of him. Go Haiju raised her spear and said she had a bad feeling. The next moment, she stabbed it into her stomach, shouting furiously that even so, she still believed him. The giant put his hands together and swung at the girl standing with a punctured stomach, intending to strike. The next second he actually hit the spot where the girl was standing, creating a loud explosion. When Sergeant Kwon Jae-yong saw this, he panicked and asked the guy if everything was going as planned, to which he replied that there was no need to worry, since all the conditions had been met. Suddenly a light began to shine from the ground around the giant. And in the next moment, under the hands of the giant in the place where the girl was supposed to be, a fire barrier began to form, which pushed back the hands of the boss. A moment later, a huge fire dragon appeared in front of the boss, who seemed not so big anymore, with flames spewing out of its mouth. This was the hidden skill of the dragon fawn. Sergeant Kwon Jae-yong and Choi Yo looked at this with astonishment, as even Choi Yo with the knowledge from the book couldn't fully imagine what would actually happen in the end. A large glowing ball of light began to form in the dragon's open mouth, which it intended to attack the poor golem, who was already regretting having gotten involved in all this. In the next moment there was a powerful explosion, from which the flames flew in all directions, and which made the ground split into small pieces. From the outside, it looked like a large, even compared to the city, golden explosion in the shape of a dome, which shone with a bright light. Sergeant Kwon Jae-yong, who was watching from the side, noted to himself that with such a skill, it would be impossible to avoid casualties in the city, as his strength was enormous. While Choi Yo approached the girl who was breathing heavily after using such a strong skill and asked if she was alright, Kwon Jae-yong realized that the guy's book was even more dangerous than the girl's skill, because it contained too much dangerous information. If it fell into the wrong hands, their city would have fallen a long time ago. Looking at Choi Yo, who was helping the exhausted Go Haiju walk, the sergeant noted that it was fortunate she had gotten a guy like that. An information window appeared, congratulating the people of the city for successfully completing the defense mission, and notifying them that all residents outside the city limits would be transported back. And also all survivors would be rewarded. Hearing all this, the residents began chanting the names of their heroes and congratulating them on their victory. Next, a system window appeared in front of each resident, showing them the total reward, which could have been 300 points, but due to the destruction of one of the bases, they were taken off 25% of the penalty, leaving them with only 225 points. But the rewards didn't end there. There were also individual rewards that were totaled based on their contributions to raiding monsters, defending a base, and defeating bosses. Afflicted and wounded residents who already thought that nothing good in their lives will not happen, could not believe their ears. Is it really a reward, just like the game? Also in front of them opened a store with the ability to buy all sorts of skills, items, equipment, experience and most importantly treatment, which was very welcome for the thousands of wounded citizens. This news was especially happy for the local hospital, where they had already started asking patients to first of all choose a treatment in the in-game store. The prices were as follows: for 10 points one could buy a treatment that healed all wounds, purification that cleansed all abnormal negative effects, and regeneration that restored lost body parts. Choi Yo was also happily browsing the store and was glad that now even the injured would be fine. He didn't even suspect any trick, as he didn't know all the properties of his book yet. But then all around him froze from incomprehension. And our hero along with them all had one question: where all the points went and why they got 0 points. However, the system window also indicated the reason, all because of the sovereignty sacrifice effect. People who had just had hope began to feel nervous about what was happening. Who could be so heartless to do this to them? What a sacrifice of sovereignty. They were all desperately demanding their points back. Go Haiju desperately asked Choi Yo what was going on, but he couldn't answer her since he didn't know anything himself. And now he was trying to figure out his system window where he was being explained the additional conditions of his sovereignty sacrifice skill. There were 3 additional conditions. If 10% of the residents were sacrificed, then his reward would be doubled. If 20% were sacrificed, then tripled, and finally if 90% of the residents were sacrificed, then his reward would be increased 100 times. And then from all sides there were sounds of notifications coming in, showing the people who were able to earn the most points. In third place was someone with 312 points, in second place was someone with 1402 points. And finally in first was Choi Yo with 996, 884, 4850 points, and now everyone knew his name and who all the points were now. For a moment, the faces of the townspeople still held disbelief and misunderstanding. But after a second, their emotions changed drastically and anger and despair filled them. They immediately rushed at Choi Yo with a barrage of questions and threats, only to be stopped by the sergeant and Go Haiju, who prevented them from lynching. Choi Yo tried to justify that he didn't know about the book, but no one believed him and wouldn't listen to him. Kwon Jae-yong advised him to stay calm and focus on healing the wounded first. But to do that, he asked him to find a way to share his points with others. Unless of course he took them on purpose. Choi Yo was absolutely fine with it and was genuinely happy to help. But as soon as he tried to do so, a notification appeared in front of him that his passive skill monopolistic desire of Demon King Crossen prohibited him from giving items or points to others. While he was puzzled what kind of skill this was, from the crowd of angry residents were heard demanding to immediately return their points, and if he did not do so, everyone will consider him a villain. He had an idea to try to buy items for recovery and give them to people, but the same notice did not let him do it. This made him nervous, so he threw the cursed book on the ground and asked Go Haiju to burn it. She tried to do so with her spear, and at first it looked like they had succeeded and the book burned. But as soon as he tried to open the store again, the book materialized out of thin air behind him and he again failed to pass it on to the others. He looked at the cursed book he couldn't get rid of. Choi Yo fell to the ground with impotent rage and began pounding it with his fists, his friends staring at him in bewilderment. Someone in the crowd desperately asked him for 10 points to help the dying woman. Someone shouted "Mommy," and angry cries spread throughout the figure that they trusted the bastard and were definitely threatening him with a quick death if they could get to him. The sergeant was listening to a report from one of his subordinates who was reporting that the casualties were increasing and the citizens were furious. And while Choi Yo was desperately trying to find anything that could help the others, an automatic rifle was held to the back of his head. And Kwon Jae-yong told him that enough of this futile endeavor was for the best. Then, while still holding the assault rifle to the head of the kneeling Choi Yo, the sergeant told him that he had been arrested. Upon hearing this, the people who heard the sergeant's words became furious and indignant, shouting for the guy to be forced to give up all his glasses, some even suggesting that he kill the crook. However, Go Haiju, who was holding back the angry crowd, firmly told them to remain calm. At the same moment, Sergeant Kwon Jae-yong leaned over to the protagonist and told him to run away, adding that he should find a way to get out of here and then make things right, which was all he could offer him at the moment. Hearing this, Choi Yo's eyes widened in surprise. However, realizing that this was his only chance that could not be missed, he clenched his hand into a fist with firm determination. Then, under the gaze of the angry crowd who started shouting asking what he was doing, Choi Yo opened a game store and started buying dexterity characteristics for points. In the next moment, he jumped into the air at a great speed and disappeared, leaving behind the puzzled looks of the crowd, who did not immediately realize what had happened. After most of the crowd came to their senses and realized what had happened, there were angry cries that the crook who had taken everything from them had fled. But they had no time for indignation and cursing the guy, because the next moment they heard the sounds of notifications from system windows from everywhere. They displayed the information that there were 24 hours left until the next move. This information shocked everyone, as there was very little time for a break and preparation. The outraged and pitiful cries were heard again. However, Sergeant Kwon Jae-yong, who realized that their complaints would not change anything, started shouting for everyone to go to safe areas as soon as possible. Hearing his command, people began to evacuate quickly, some running as fast as they could to get a better spot while others helped the wounded. But in the midst of all the chaos, a girl with a spear in her hands stood in the middle of the street without moving. It was none other than Go Haiju, who was staring resolutely into the distance. In front of the huge crowd of gathered citizens, there was a man standing on a dais who addressed the people and said that those who wanted to fight should stand on the left, while those who wanted to evacuate should stand on the right. He also reminded everyone to check their status window more often and not to leave the evacuation center without permission. In addition, everyone also needed to remember where the temporary bases were as well as the other evacuation centers. However, one of the most important rules was that they had to immediately run away as soon as they saw Choi Yo. Covering their ears, they had to run away from him as soon as possible and then report his whereabouts to the authorities. Also, if anyone heard any advice from him about the raid, that person should isolate themselves until the mission is over. At the same time, the silhouette of some guy was drawing some red circle on the ground. Drawing with red chalk on the floor, he could hear the rules that were announced in the square, specifically that if someone was a victim of sovereignty but hid it from the public, it would be considered a violation of the law and would be punished accordingly. The guy drawing the circle was our protagonist Choi Yo. After the ground rules were announced to the public, the town was back to life, though not quite as it had been before. After all, they now had a very important task, namely to survive in this damn game. Everyone was doing what they could, the military was developing tactics. Some were training, hoping to get stronger. Others were standing in line for groceries to meet their minimum needs, namely food. Some got into fights, while others went to church hoping to be saved there. But one way or another, the time for a new move had come. And the players who were playing a game in which millions of lives were at stake once again rolled their dice. Pawn 8, which was the city in which these events were taking place, had to move 4 squares forward. After moving 4 squares, the figure arrived at the seal of the Demon King, which was announced by a system window that appeared in front of everyone. The people's task was to destroy all the demonic pillars that would appear, as well as the defenders that would guard them. In case of failure to do so in the allotted time, the Demon King would be summoned. The time allotted to complete the mission was 5 days. While the number of pillars that needed to be destroyed was 3. The level of the first pillar defender, however, was level 1. He was the fallen angel of fate, who was a fallen angel who wandered around in search of his destiny. Even though he had 2 pairs of wings that gave him a resemblance to the concept of an angel, he did look creepy. The difficulty of the second pillar protector was also like the first one, was at level 1. The second defender's name was Mad Brains. He had a metallic physique that resembled the body of a praying mantis, while his head had huge brains protruding outwards. As the information from the system window stated, it was a creature that couldn't stop creating things, and the more time it spent creating things, the better the things it created were. The difficulty of the third pillar protector was different from the first 2, however, as it was equal to level 3. After reading this information, Go Haiju and Kwon Jae-yong were stunned, as this difficulty was many times harder than the first 2. In front of some large building, a large pillar appeared where the ground used to be, the crystal at the end of which was burning red. At the foot of it stood the figure of a creature whose build resembled that of a human, but its skin was green in color. According to the information from the notification window, it was a defender of the pillar of the third difficulty, namely the Goblin swordsman Jack. He was a swordsman goblin who had reached the peak of martial arts and had undergone a body transformation. In addition, he was trying to break the seal of the Demon King to challenge him. At the same time, Choi Yo was lying on the ground, right on the circle he had drawn himself. There were many pieces of paper scattered around him, with some circles and text drawn on them. If you looked closer, you could see a smile on his face. At the same time, the bewildered Sergeant Kwon Jae-yong, who was holding a walkie-talkie, received an urgent message that the civilians had launched an attack. Then a voice added that even though they tried to stop them, they were almost impossible to control. After listening to the information, Kwon Jae-yong said with determination that it was time for them to take over as well. Then turning to Go Haiju, he asked what she was going to do. But there was no answer. The soldier she was standing next to a moment ago said that she had left. Hearing the soldier's words, he thought about the mess that was going on. Their perfect system and cooperation had fallen in just one day. At the same time, the escaped girl, holding her spear in her hand, stood in front of the pillar under which the third-level defender was sitting. Adopting a fighting stance, she looked at the opponent in front of her with determination in her gaze. Who was even just sitting relaxedly by the pillar, exuding a blue aura. However, Go Haiju's determination was unstoppable. In the next moment, she rushed straight at the defender, activating her new ability that made her hair glow a bright golden color, as well as displaying her legendary level spear, which she intended to use to strike. In the next second, it actually reached its target, causing a loud explosion to occur. However, despite its force, to the girl's surprise, the defender was not only unharmed, but as if he had not made any effort to put his sword in front of him, he was able to stop her spear without much effort. In the next moment, with a slight movement, he swung his sword. It was only this slight movement that threw the girl back. Then raising the sword, which began to glow with a blue light upwards, he brought it down with speed imperceptible to the human eye. At that instant, a white line of light appeared in front of the girl, who was still in the air, which seemed to have already split her head in half. A monstrously powerful explosion sounded in the middle of the city, which was accompanied by the release of a shockwave of blue aura. The goblin defender sitting under the pillar looked up for the first time with a look of mild bewilderment in his eyes. Not far from him, someone landed on the ground. As it turned out, it was Choi Yo, who held the surprised Go Haiju in his arms and stepped onto the ground. Putting the girl on the ground, he asked her to inform his men that he would spend all their rewards on himself. Hearing this, the girl irritably replied that it was already obvious. Leaving her behind and heading towards the pillar under which the protector was sitting, he added that she should also tell her people not to appear in front of him if they didn't want him to steal their rewards. The girl wanted to say something to Choi Yo, who was leaving. However, he materialized his book in the next moment and it immediately appeared in his hand. Holding the open book in his hand, the guy headed towards the pillar while thinking that there was no way to give people their experience points back, nor was there any way to escape from the Demon King's damn book. By status, he said, turning to the system window, which at the same moment opened the store and informed him that his level would be raised by 1 for every unit of characteristic. When Go Haiju asked the system what number he needed to set to increase his skills, he replied with a smile on his face that everything needed to be maxed out. Suddenly, the system window started sending Go Haiju a bunch of notifications to the bewildered Go Haiju who didn't understand what was going on. However, they didn't just come to her, but to everyone who was trapped in the game. Seeing the notifications that Choi Yo was the first person to reach level 100 in stamina, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, luck, and health, a lot of people were furious and held a grudge because they realized that it was all thanks to their points. At the same time, Choi Yo, who was surrounded by a golden aura, was surprised by his new strength and asked the system how many equipment dices he had received. The system immediately said that the total was 432,512. Hearing this, he ordered the system to get rid of everything below magic class, and also automatically cast all the dice for anything that would give equipment above heroic class. As a result, the system counted 142 pieces of legendary class equipment, as well as 1,023 heroic. In the next moment, the guy received a notification that the system had tagged all the items he had received, causing a cylinder to form around Choi Yo. Glowing with a bright light and also consisting of hologram windows with the weapons he had received. Go Haiju was shocked by what she saw, looking at it all with wide-opened eyes, while the goblin protector smiled happily, seeing the guy as a worthy opponent. The same decided to himself that he would use all the items, bloody rewards, as well as the power of the Demon King. Being equipped with the best equipment, holding a sword in one hand and an open book in the other, Choi Yo decided to himself that he would protect this city at all costs and then return to his normal life. Since if this was the only way to atone for his sins, he didn't care if he was judged or insulted by others or not. As he continued to sit under the pillar, as the system window said that Goblin swordsman Jack was beginning to smile and prepare to attack at the sight of a strong opponent, he did indeed begin to smile, and a more intense aura began to emanate from him, which made it clear that he was excited about the fight. However, to the goblin's surprise, Choi Yo, who was equipped with heroic-grade magical air shoes that allowed the wearer to jump and soar with a force comparable to flight while expending the wearer's mana, turned to say that he didn't have time to play with him right now. He then shot into the sky and shouted for him to wait for him, promising that he would be back soon. Seeing this, Go Haiju wondered if Choi Yo would really just leave like that. She turned her gaze to the goblin swordsman who was staring at the floor again. She also couldn't understand why he just sat down as if he really intended to wait for the guy. At the same time jumping at a tremendous speed between buildings, leaving behind only residual images. Choi Yo was approaching the first pillar defender at a great speed. Since the goblin didn't attack first, it could be left alone and untouched for now. Sensing the approaching danger, the fallen soul angel fearfully turned towards the danger. However, this didn't save him from Choi Yo's foot, which slammed into his face in the next second. Looking at the defender who had his foot on his face at this moment, Choi Yo said to himself that the first thing he had to do was to fight the other defenders. While the people who saw Choi Yo's appearance shouted angrily and violently that he should be killed, Choi Yo continued to fight the first pillar's protector, moving lightning fast across the sky and houses. As he moved at breakneck speed through the air and holding his sword in his hand, he remembered what he had read in the book, namely the information that the unique trait of the pillar protector would be activated if the right conditions were met. These traits added weaknesses to the defender, thus increasing the chances of defeating him. Striking again at the defender who was able to dodge successfully after reacting in time, Choi Yo also realized that if the wrong conditions were met, strong traits could be unlocked that would be difficult to deal with. After dodging the guy's attack, the angel protector immediately rushed to counterattack, waving his clawed hands, which despite its appearance was a very formidable weapon. In the case of this defender he was fighting at the moment, if he killed 100 people, he would become a fallen angel who would be capable of destroying all of humanity. In addition to becoming much stronger, he would also be able to leave the pillar to start killing everything in his path. Drawing his sword and swinging it forcefully, thus cutting off the angelic bird's wings, Choi Yo decided that he had to start by getting rid of the guardians with those annoying traits and unlocking the traits that were necessary for the mission. The angel guardian shedding its wings began to fall to the ground. Taking advantage of this, the protagonist sped up with the help of his magical boots, allowing him to walk on air. He headed after it, reflecting on the fact that the most important thing was not the completion of the mission, but how it was completed. At the same time, a military truck was driving along the road, which had a huge number of holes and cracks. In the cab of the truck sat the already known to us Sergeant Kwon Jae-young, who talking to someone on the radio reported the order, which was to stand at least 500 meters from the pillars. Since they were not yet sure of the purpose of Choi Yo's intervention. As he finished talking and looked out the window, he wondered if the guy had never found a way to return the reward, or if he had just decided not to do it at all. Kwon Jae-young thought back to the time he had spent with him and noted that he was not a bad person, but he decided not to make a decision based on his feelings. Thinking back to the power he had shown, he noted that a man with such intelligence and strength could rule an entire city if he wanted to. Even Go Haiju, who was completely out of control, could help them along with Choi Yo. Can we accomplish this mission? Wondered the sergeant. However, his thoughts were interrupted by a loud explosion that occurred right next to the truck. The shockwave was so strong that he was immediately thrown aside like a feather. Kwon Jae-young got out of the wrecked truck and looked around, not paying attention to the soldier who was asking if he was all right. But shifting his gaze to where the explosion had been, he didn't need any more explanation. At the sight of the explosion, there was some guy standing on top of the body of the defeated guardian angel. In one hand was a sword, while in the other he held the halo and wings that belonged to the former. As expected, this guy was none other than Choi Yo. The sword he had was called Divine Divide, which belonged to the legendary class. In its description, there was a legend that it was a fragment, the sword that once divided earth and heaven and also created the world. But in its current form, it had lost most of its power. Even so, it could turn the amputated parts of monsters into objects. Approaching Choi Yul, Sergeant Kwon Jae-yong replied in surprise that the latter had managed to defeat the Pillar Protector single-handedly, also adding that he didn't expect to see him here. But the latter only smilingly nodded his head in response. The next moment he jumped into the air and disappeared from the sergeant's sight. Who, noting that the boy did not speak, concluded that he probably had no bad intentions. The soldier behind him suddenly and fearfully turned to Kwon Jae-yong and started to talk about the Pillar Protector, pointing at him with his shaking hand. But he was interrupted by the confident voice of the sergeant, who, thinking that the soldier was simply surprised by the pillar's death, replied that he should have simply reported to the command that it had been destroyed. But as it turned out, the soldier's excitement was not in vain, and the protector was indeed alive. In the system window that appeared the next moment was a message that the condition for the special trait was met, which was to remove the wings and halo from the fallen angel. The result of unlocking the special trait, however, was a spoilage that would turn the fallen angel into another creature without destiny. Just as the message said, ugly body parts began to grow on the defender's already disfigured head. After a while, a completely different creature that looked like a dinosaur stood in front of the stunned Sergeant Kwon Jae-yong and the ordinary soldier. It was a spoil beast with a difficulty level of 2. It was a beast that had lost faith and fallen to sin. Because of which, the god no longer looked after him. Looking at the monster in front of him, he came to the conclusion that the warrior's life was indeed a shit. But luckily reinforcements had already arrived in the form of a group of 5 men, each armed with a machine gun. Kwon Jae-yong looked around and assessed his capabilities and realized that since there were only 3 monsters in this mission, they were probably as strong as the entire raid. As he began to fire at the pillar defender, he wondered if Choi Yul had left this monster on them. The reinforcements that arrived followed suit and also fired at the monster. One of them contacted the headquarters and requested for support, giving their current location. The pillar defender, who was sitting on the building at the time, pushed off the wall. At breakneck speed, lunged at the group of soldiers, attempting to damage them with his huge paw. Luckily, it managed to dodge and escape unharmed. However, surviving was not the same as not losing morale. In the next moment, frightened by the monster's attack, they panicked and began to flee, leaving Sergeant Kwon Jae-yong alone with the monster. The same having a helmet that removed all the negative emotions that could prevent him from thinking straight and fighting, looked at his comrades who were running away calling for help from their mother. Gritting his teeth in anger, he began to retreat, leading the monster behind him, while continuing to shoot at it, attracting its attention. Leading the monster away from his frightened comrades, he told himself that he had to hold out until reinforcements arrived. The monster, which was much faster than a normal human, opened its terrifying maw and was already flying at him. Sensing the danger, Kwon Jae-yong turned around. However, it did not help in any way. In the next second, the pillar's protector stepped on him with his huge paw. A pool of blood immediately formed underneath. Choi Yul threw the book he couldn't get rid of into the air. Then he closed it with a smile on his face and said, "Great, I got one." At the same time, a bright green light began to shine out from under the paw of the monster that was supposed to swat the sergeant, leaving the monster bewildered. In the next second, his paw was forcefully thrown back by the bright green light, which formed into something like a barrier. A hand holding a green flag rose from where the sergeant's corpse should have been. A message appeared in the notification window, announcing that the conditions for Helden's hidden helmet skill had been met. The person leaning on the flag and standing on one knee was none other than Kwon Jae-yong, who was still alive despite being completely covered in blood. Holding the assault rifle in one hand and the flag in the other, he was muttering something to himself. The first condition for activating the hidden skill was to be on the verge of death from a dark attack or a spoil strike. The second condition was that the owner of the helmet had to be the leader of a group of more than 5 people. The resulting skill was called the Spirit of Helden. When the skill was activated, the wearer became possessed by the evil spirit of Helden, who was an inquisitor of heretics. In the next moment, his image appeared behind Kwon Jae-yong. He was glowing with a green light and also emitted an aura. And of course, he resembled Susanoo. The duration of the skill was 10 minutes, during which time all equipment and skills were imbued with divine power. The defense against darkness and spoilage was also increased. Also when activated, the wielder entered the fanatic mode, in which he received an increase in the characteristics of attack, defense and recovery, as well as becoming immune to any emotion. He would also lose his mind and attack all monsters of darkness and corruption. When he saw that the person he was supposed to kill had survived and was also radiating great power, the monster was surprised. While Quan Jae-yong continued to mutter fanatical nonsense. But the benefits of this special skill didn't end there, as the next moment the system reported that the fanatic skill had been activated for all members of the team. As a result, in front of the members of his squad who a moment ago were running in panic, a patterned sign also appeared on their foreheads and their eyes turned green. Fiercely shouting some fanatical phrases, they already rushed towards the monster without a drop of fear. Choi Yo, who was watching from above, got goosebumps as it looked even more terrifying than he had imagined.